From the very first moment, you could feel it in the air, a tension so sharp it cut through the noise of everyday life. Something was building, something that no one could fully name, but everyone could sense it. Started as whispers in hallways, murmurs, in late-night conversations, rumors that seemed too strange to be true and yet too consistent to be ignored. Then came the first cracks in the silence. Small revelations that should have ended the speculation, but instead only fueled it because each answer raised more questions. Each denial created more suspicion. Each silence felt like confirmation. And suddenly the story was no longer confined to the people at the center of it. It spread through the streets, through the homes, through the minds of everyone watching until it became impossible to look away. This is not just scandal, this is not just drama. This is a story that challenges what we believe about truth, about loyalty, about justice itself. The ground is shifting beneath us, and the storm that has been threatening for so long is now here. The figures at the center of this saga are not simply fighting for their reputations. They are fighting for control of the narrative itself. And as we peel back the layers, you will see how deep the cracks go, how fragile the structures we trusted really are, and why the public itself has become more than an audience. They are now part of the story. So stay with me, because what you are about to hear is not just shocking, it is haunting. And once you step inside this story, you may never look at truth and silence the same way again. Blake Lively, once known as the Golden Girl of Hollywood, has now found herself in the center of a storm unlike anything she or her carefully polished team could have anticipated. Because this time the whispers are not fading away and the headlines are not bending in her favor. Instead, a leaked New York Times video has ripped through the entertainment industry with the force of a tidal wave shattering the long-cultivated image of America's sweetheart, and dragging names like Justin Baldoni, Ryan Reynolds, Colleen Hoover, and even Taylor Swift into a tangled web of drama strategy and alleged orchestration. The footage that surfaced was more than just a behind-the-scenes glimpse. It was a carefully timed detonation that revealed a side of Blake. Most people never imagined a side where charm was replaced by cold strategy, and where innocence gave way to control and manipulation. Viewers who once adored her are now replaying the leaked clips again and again in disbelief, asking themselves how much of what they thought they knew was carefully staged and how much of it was real. What exactly was said between Blake and Justin that ignited such outrage? And why has this footage only emerged now when months of rumors and denials had already clouded the narrative? Insiders say the answer is simple timing. This was not an accident. This was the result of months of tension boiling under the surface and finally erupting when Blake and Ryan least expected it. While Blake and her attorneys scrambled to dismiss Justin Baldoni's $400 million lawsuit, claiming it was nothing but an abuse of the legal system, the footage spoke louder than any legal filing or PR-crafted statement, because if the world has learned anything about Hollywood, it is that image matters more than truth, and perception can destroy faster than any judge ever could imagine. Watching Blake Lively, who has for years held herself as the epitome of grace and poise, suddenly revealed in a light that left fans unsettled and even shocked, because the same woman who once seemed untouchable is now caught in a storm that threatens not only her career, but her entire carefully constructed empire. And yet this is only the beginning, because as Justin's camp celebrated a legal victory, blocking Blake's team from silencing him with a gag order, the stakes escalated dramatically and the playing field shifted in a way few expected. Suddenly, what was meant to bury Justin turned into ammunition that now threatens to bury Blake. The irony could not be sharper. Ryan Reynolds, known for his wit and charm, found himself pulled into the quicksand, too, as he filed his own dismissal motions, only for them to backfire, publicly fueling speculation that the couple was less confident in their innocence and more desperate to stop the unraveling of secrets that could shatter their legacy forever. But the real twist comes with the revelation that the viral footage painting Justin as a man crossing boundaries was in fact selectively edited, chopped, and framed to tell only one side of the story. And when Justin's team released the unedited version, the internet gasped, not only because it showed a very different reality, but because it raised the haunting question of how far Blake and her allies may have gone to protect their version of events. This revelation has already become the fuel for endless debates, with fans dissecting every frame of the footage and commentators warning that if such a calculated manipulation could happen in this case, then what other narratives in Hollywood have been engineered with similar precision? The unedited scene shows Justin moving with care, restraint, and professionalism, like someone walking on glass to avoid any misunderstanding, a far cry from the desperate figure Blake's camp had originally painted. And when that truth hit the airwaves, the dominoes began to fall, and suddenly it was not just about one clip. It was about trust, credibility, and the chilling possibility that a star as beloved as Blake Lively might have built her story on fragile illusions. Insiders whisper that Blake is doubling down, refusing to admit fault, and hiding behind legal maneuvers that may not hold in the long run. Her polished victim card, once so effective, is now collapsing under the weight of evidence, and the public reaction has been merciless. Fans who once defended her are beginning to distance themselves. Industry insiders are reportedly wary of attaching their projects to her name and even her once promising business ventures. Like her hair care line are faltering with sales plummeting, 70% leaving critics to ask whether the empire was ever built on genuine foundations or just another extension of a carefully managed persona. This story is no longer about one leaked video or one lawsuit. It has become a case study in how power, fame, and perception can be weaponized in Hollywood. And as the battle between Justin and Blake moves closer to trial, the stakes are no longer just about money. They are about survival. Because if the courtroom sees what the world has already seen, then Blake and Ryan could be staring down a reality where their carefully maintained thrones crumble beneath them, and the very industry that once embraced them decides they are no longer worth protecting. The city was still trembling from the echoes of what had already unfolded when another layer of mystery began to spread through the streets like a shadow that nobody could quite name. People were speaking in hushed tones about decisions made behind closed doors, rulings that were supposed to bring clarity, but instead only deepened the fog of uncertainty. There was talk of conversations overheard whispers that suggested the truth had not yet been fully revealed, and the more those whispers grew, the more the air itself seemed charged with a kind of electricity that pressed against everyone's chest like a weight. What was most unsettling was not the violence that had been seen, or the rulings that had been handed down, but the sense that something larger was still waiting to break through, something that would not be stopped by the boundaries of courts or the voices of commentators. There were fragments of stories coming from unexpected places. A cab driver who swore he had seen a meeting between faces no one thought would ever share the same room, a shopkeeper who claimed to have overheard a promise spoken so quietly it almost vanished in the air, and even an office worker who insisted that a document had been passed across a desk under circumstances that no one could fully explain. All of these accounts floated in the city's bloodstream, leaving ordinary people to wonder how much was rumor, how much was fabrication, and how much was a glimpse of the hidden. Machinery moving everything forward, and through it all, there was a tension that could be felt in every conversation. Even those as simple as neighbors speaking across fences. Everyone seemed to know that the present moment was not fixed, that it could tilt one way or another at any second. The question that pulsed through the minds of so many was whether the tilt would bring resolution or only chaos, even greater than what had already been endured. And so people waited, they went through their daily motions, buying food, commuting, working, caring for their families. But beneath all of those actions lived a quiet readiness, as if at any second a bell might ring and all that was concealed would come tumbling into the open. And it was in that readiness that something even stranger began to unfold. Because out of nowhere, figures who had remained silent for months, even years, started to speak. Some of them chose to release carefully crafted statements that raised more questions. Then they answered others, allowed a look or a gesture to be captured by cameras that seemed to reveal more than they intended. And in one particularly shocking moment, a figure long assumed to be out of the story entirely appeared at a gathering in the heart of the city, and the crowd that saw them froze, because they understood instantly that their presence meant the game was nowhere near finished. This was not closure. This was escalation. Yet it was an escalation that wore the mask of calm, as if the city was a stage upon which actors had stepped forward to deliver their lines. While behind the curtain, the real story, the real battle was taking place unseen. And what gnawed at people was the suspicion that by the time they glimpsed even a fraction of it, the damage would already be done. Still, the fragments accumulated, piling higher until they could not be ignored. Newspapers printed them with cautious language. Broadcasters debated them with careful tones. But the people in the streets felt the urgency in their bones, and they began to ask questions aloud, questions that no one seemed prepared to answer. And as those questions spread, something shifted, because the story was no longer confined to those directly involved. It belonged to everyone. It had become a current sweeping through the lives of strangers, pulling them into a narrative they had never agreed to join. And the strange truth was that no one could step out of it anymore because the very foundations of trust had been shaken. And once that happens, the cracks can spread without warning. Those who thought they were safe in silence now faced the possibility of being drawn out into the open. Those who believed their alliances would shield them began to wonder if betrayal was only one step behind them, and those who had built reputations on certainty found themselves standing in the quicksand of doubt. And through it all, one name kept surfacing, whispered in doorways, muttered on late-night phone calls, written in the margins of notes passed hand to hand. That name had become the center of gravity around which the chaos spun. But the terrifying part was that no one could say whether speaking that name would summon protection or destruction. And so people spoke it only when they had to, and always in tones that suggested reverence. Fear and disbelief mixed into one. The deeper this uncertainty ran, the more fragile the surface of normal life became, as though the city itself was cracking under the weight of what it carried. And the most haunting part was the sense that this was only the middle of the story, not its end, and everyone knew what the middle meant. It meant more revelations, it meant darker truths waiting just beyond the horizon, and it meant that those who thought they had already endured the worst were about to learn that the true storm had not yet broken. The nights grew heavier, as though the city itself understood that the sun had become a fragile shield against the weight of what was still unfolding. Every street lamp seemed dimmer, every alley carried echoes that refused to fade, and within that atmosphere people began noticing patterns that were impossible to dismiss. Certain figures kept reappearing in the background of unrelated events. Certain conversations seemed to circle back to the same hidden truths, as if the story itself was tightening its grip around a single point. And yet no one could quite identify that point in full, which made the sense of dread all the more powerful. Some swore they saw familiar faces slipping through back entrances at hours when no business should have been conducted. Others whispered about records being altered, files, vanishing details rewritten, as though the past itself was being reshaped to serve a purpose only a few could understand. But the most alarming detail was not what was being erased. It was what was being introduced, fragments of information that had no origin, whispers that seemed to appear from nowhere, documents that seemed authentic, yet carried no trace of where they had come from. And as these pieces circulated, they did more than confuse. They divided. Neighbors began to mistrust neighbors. Friends began to question friends. The idea of truth itself became slippery like water in cupped hands, and with that slipperiness came fear. Because once truth becomes uncertain, power belongs to whoever can tell the loudest story. And that reality was beginning to settle over the city like a storm cloud. The institutions people had always relied on to deliver clarity seemed hesitant, almost paralyzed. Officials spoke, but their words were weighed down by caution. Experts offered analysis, but their voices cracked under the strain of constant contradiction. And so the crowd turned to one another, searching for certainty in the eyes of strangers, but finding only reflections of their own unease. There were moments when the tension spilled into sudden outbursts. A street corner filled with shouts. A crowd outside a courthouse erupting not in violence, but in an anguished demand to know what was being hidden behind the walls, and each outburst was like a spark threatening to ignite a blaze that could not be contained. Yet somehow each time the fire burned hot, it was quickly smothered by an invisible hand, as though someone or something had already prepared for these eruptions, guiding them back into silence. And that was perhaps the most frightening discovery, that the silence itself seemed orchestrated, controlled, engineered. Not by chance, but by intent. And the question of who was doing the orchestrating became the obsession of thousands. Theories multiplied faster than they could be disproved. Some insisted it was the work of those already in power, desperate to protect their legacy. Others believed it was the rise of a hidden faction, stepping out of the shadows at last, and a few even whispered that it was no longer the actions of people at all, but the momentum of history itself, a current so strong that no individual could resist it, whatever the explanation. The effect was the same. No one trusted the world they had once known, and in that absence of trust came desperation. Desperation to hold on to something solid, even if it meant clinging to illusions, and that desperation drove people to act in ways they never thought they would. Documents were stolen, conversations were recorded, meetings, once private, were exposed by hidden devices, and each revelation, no matter how small, was devoured by a public starving for answers. Yet no answer was enough. Each one only sharpened The hunger only deepened the suspicion until the city felt like a great machine grinding itself to pieces under the pressure, and in the midst of that grinding, another shadow began to lengthen a figure who had remained quiet while others fought. For attention, a figure who had been dismissed by some as irrelevant and by others as powerless. But now their silence seemed less like weakness and more like calculation. Because when they finally spoke, the effect was unlike anything the city had. Felt before the words were simple, the tone measured, but the impact was seismic. For in those words lay an accusation that reframed everything that had come before and hinted at something far darker still to come. The moment those words were spoken, conversations stopped. Crowds froze, broadcasts cut to emergency analysis, and for the first time in weeks, the city seemed to breathe as one collective breath, drawn in shock and held in anticipation of what the next moment would bring. But the next moment brought no clarity. Instead, it brought contradiction, denials from some, confirmations from others, and most disturbingly of all, silence from those who could have provided certainty, yet chose not to. That silence was louder than any denial, louder than any confirmation because it left space for the imagination to run wild. And in that space, the people saw possibilities that terrified them. Alliances collapsing, betrayals revealed structures, once thought permanent, crumbling into dust. And the longer that silence stretched, the more it seemed to confirm that something enormous was approaching, something no one was prepared to face. And so the city lived in that suspended moment, trapped between revelation and collapse, waiting for the next strike of lightning to illuminate the darkness. In the end, the story did not deliver the neat resolution so many had prayed for. Instead, it left the city suspended in a space between truth and shadow. And that suspension itself became the most haunting revelation of all, because it forced people to see that certainty had never been guaranteed, that every word spoken, every action taken carried with it the weight of interpretation, and that weight could shift depending on who held it. What the people had endured was more than scandal, more than legal battle, more than whispered betrayal. It was a mirror held up to every assumption they had carried about trust, loyalty, justice, and the hidden costs of silence. And in that mirror, they saw that even the strongest structures could fracture when pressed by doubt. Yet within that fracture, there was also something else. Not only fear, but resilience. Not only suspicion, but a relentless hunger to know the truth. And that hunger could not be erased, not by orchestrated silences, not by rewritten records, not even by shadows moving in the background. Because once people awaken to the fragility of the world they inhabit, they cannot unsee it. They cannot unhear the whispers. They cannot forget the faces that surfaced in the darkness. And so the city prepared itself not for an ending, but for another beginning. A beginning born not of closure, but of confrontation, for the storm that had threatened for so long was no longer waiting on the horizon, it was here. And though no one knew exactly where the first strike would land, they knew with certainty that the sound would be heard by all and nothing would remain untouched.